Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I am back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to go over a 1844 account of traveling the Oregon Trail. And there's some crazy stories out there, and we've all heard stories, here and there of the hardships and challenges faced by the pioneers and travelers of the Oregon Trail and pioneers in the Great Plains and stuff like that. But as a kid growing up in the Western Great Plains, you would always hear these passed down pioneer stories usually from your grandparents, and they were telling stories about their parents or their grandparents, but it wasn't too far removed generationally, and especially because some of my grandparents were born in the very early 1900s, so if they're telling stories about their parents or grandparents, you're already back into the mid 1800s at that point. So, you would hear these stories about the grasshopper or locust plagues that totally destroyed crops. You would hear about these blizzards and heat waves and the tornadoes and droughts, and the Great Plains were crazy when it came to weather. Growing up there, I loved growing up there, but it definitely was crazy, and I think growing up there, you could get a feel for what it might have been like for the Oregon Trail travelers. I remember times when I was young being outside in the middle of the winter. It might be 70 degrees outside, and within an hour, it's minus 10 and it's snowing, so people were outside in shorts, and all of a sudden, you're scooping snow. Shortly after that. It's just the weather could change on a dime. And growing up in Nebraska, they always said if you don't like the weather, go inside for a little bit and come back outside, because the weather would literally change that fast. And it did a lot. And, the old pioneer people used to live in the sod houses, and I got to, experience a bit of that. Our uncle had a 2-story sod house that was still on his ranch in the Nebraska Sandhills from, his parents, and you get to see some of this stuff kind of firsthand from the old pioneer living days. And anyhow, as a child, I also lived through seven or eight tornadoes in one night. I don't remember exactly how many. It was 7 or it was 8, and they destroyed a huge part of our town. And they made movies and books out of it, and everything. And it was a crazy occurrence. So, and it's one of my earlier childhood memories, and it's just burned into my brain. I'll never forget. And I'm sure that type of mentality or those type of situations, I'm sure this is exactly what happened to this girl. She was a 9-year-old girl at this point, and she's the one telling the story of 1844 being on the Oregon Trail. And the Oregon Trail in 1844 was brand new. There had been very little travel on the trail at this point. And this girl, Catherine Sager, I believe she wrote the stories about 16 years later when she was married. Her name was Catherine Sager Pringle at that point. And this story comes out of an Oregon Trail Stories book. But I believe it's probably the same type of situation as a young child. The things she experienced on the trail were probably vividly burned into her brain, where she would never forget these occurrences, even though she was pretty young. And when the tornadoes happened, I was younger than that. So, and there's just things that I will never forget. So, anyhow, not only do I have a bit of experience with crazy weather on the Great Plains, and now we have early warning systems and tornado sirens and all kinds of stuff like that, and they didn't have any of that. These weather patterns and things like this just came out of nowhere. when people were on the trail, or pioneers or whatever. But anyhow, nonetheless, we're going to go over Catherine Sager Pringle's account of her story of what happened to her in 1844 going down the trail. And we're only going to cover a couple of pages of her account, but it's enough to give you an idea of just some of the craziness that she lived through, and that a lot of pioneers and travelers on the trail would have lived through back in those days. And you can look up, there's going to be a heck of a lot more that happened after they got to Washington, Oregon area. There's a lot more sadness to her story, the things that happened, but we won't get into the details. We'll just go over some of the travel in the trail and what happened. And if you want to look up more details and see what happened to her family and her siblings and stuff after they got there, you can look it up. It's in the historical record, and there's historical markers and a lot of different accounts out there of the crazy things that happened even a few years later, which probably led to her writing this account, because she had been through so much even by the time she was in her mid-20s. She wrote, "My father was one of the restless ones who are not content to remain in one place a long time. Late in the fall of 1838, we emigrated from Ohio to Missouri. Our first halting place was on the Green River, but the next year we took a farm in Platte County. He engaged in farming and blacksmithing and had a wide reputation for ingenuity. Anything they needed made or mended sought his shop. In 1843, Dr. Whitman came to Missouri. The healthful climate induced my mother to favor moving to Oregon. Immigration was the theme all winter, and we decided to start for Oregon. In late 1843, Father sold his property and moved near St. Joseph, and in April 1844 we started across the plains. My first encampments were the great pleasure to us children. We were 5 girls and 2 boys, ranging from the girl baby to be born on the way to the oldest boy hardly old enough to be of any help. We waited several days at the Missouri River. Many friends came that far to see the immigrants start on the long journey, and there was much sadness at the parting. And the sorrowful company crossed the Missouri that bright spring morning. The motion of the wagon made us all sick, and it was weeks before we got used to the seasick motion. Rain came down and required us to tie down the wagon covers, and so increased our sickness by confining the air we breathed. Our cattle recrossed in the middle of the night and went back to their winter quarters. This caused delay in recovering them and a weary forced march to rejoin the train. This was divided into companies, and we were in that company commanded by William Shaw. Soon after starting, Indians raided our camp one night and drove off a number of cattle. They were pursued but never recovered. Soon everything went smooth and our train made steady headway. The weather was fine and we enjoyed the journey pleasantly. There were several musical instruments among the immigrants, and these sounded clearly on the evening air when camp was made, and merry talk and laughter resounded from almost every campfire. We had 1 wagon, 2 steady yoke of old cattle, and several young and not well broken ones. Father, who was no ox driver, had a terrible trouble until one day he called on Captain Shaw for assistance. It was furnished by the good captain, pelting his refractory steers with stones until they were glad to come to terms. Reaching the buffalo country, our father would get someone to drive his team and start on the hunt, for he was enthusiastic in his love for such sport. He not only killed the great bison, but often brought home one on his shoulder and a timid antelope that had fallen to his unerring aim, and that are not shot by ordinary marksmen. So I think she's trying to say that it takes a very skilled marksman to bring down an antelope, and her father was a very skilled marksman. Soon after crossing South Platte, which Platte is the river in the middle of Nebraska where I grew up. Its Indian name Platte means mile wide, inch deep. It's a really good river. It's not very swift or deep, but provided a lot of water, and the Oregon Trail followed it. So soon after crossing South Platte, the unwieldy oxen ran on a bank and overturned the wagon, greatly injuring our mother. She lay long insensible in the tent put up for the occasion. August 1st, we nooned in the beautiful grove on the north side of the Platte. We had by this time got used to climbing in and out of the wagon when in motion. While performing this feat that afternoon, my dress caught on the axle helve, and I was thrown under the wagon wheel, which passed over and badly crushed my limb before my father could stop the team. He picked me up and saw the extent of the injury, when the injured limb hung dangling in the air. In the broken voice he exclaimed, "My dear child, your leg is broken all to pieces." The news soon spread along the train, and halt was called. The surgeon was found, and the limb was set. Then we pushed on the same night to Laramie, where we arrived soon after dark. This accident confined me to the wagon the remainder of the long journey. After Laramie, I believe this is Fort Laramie, after Laramie we entered the great American desert, which was hard on teams. Sickness became common. Father and the boys were all sick, and we were dependent for a driver on the Dutch doctor who set my leg. He offered his services and was employed, but though an excellent surgeon, he knew very little about driving oxen. Some of them had to rise from their sick beds to wade streams to get the oxen safely across. One day 4 buffalo ran between our wagon and the one behind. Though feeble, Father seized his gun and gave chase to them. This imprudent act prostrated him again. I think they're saying this wasn't a very bright idea, and it wore him out, and he wasn't in good shape. It soon became apparent that his days were numbered. He was fully conscious of the fact, but could not be reconciled to the thought of leaving his large and helpless family in such precarious circumstances. The evening before his death, we crossed Green River and camped on the bank. Looking where I lay helpless, he said, "Poor child, what will become of you?" Captain Shaw found him weeping bitterly. He said his last hour had come, and his heart was filled with anguish for his family. His wife was ill, the children small, and one likely to be a cripple. They had no relatives near, and a long journey lay before them. In piteous tones he begged the captain to take charge of them and see them through. This he stoutly promised. Father was buried the next day on the banks of the Green River. His coffin was made of 2 troughs dug out of the body of a tree. But the next year immigrants found his bleaching bones as the Indians had disinterred his remains. We hired a young man to drive, as Mother was afraid to trust the doctor. But the kind-hearted German would not leave her, and declared his intention to see her safe to the Willamette. At Fort Bridger, the stream was full of fish, and we made nets of wagon sheets to catch them. That evening, the new driver told Mother that he would hunt for game if she would let him use the gun. He took it, and we never saw him again. He made for the train in advance, where he had a sweetheart. We found the gun waiting our arrival at the Whitmans. Then we got along as best we could with the doctor's help. Mother planned to get to Whitman's and winter there, but she was rapidly failing under her sorrows. The nights and mornings were very cold, and she took cold from the exposure unavoidably. With camp fever and a sore mouth, she fought bravely against fate for the sake of her children, but she was taken delirious soon after reaching Fort Bridger, and was bedfast. Traveling in this condition over the road clouded with dust, she suffered intensely. She talked to her husband, addressing him as though he was present, beseeching him in piteous tones to relieve her sufferings until at last she became unconscious. Her babe was cared for by the women of the train. Those kind-hearted women would also come in at night and wash the dust from the mother's face and otherwise make her comfortable. We traveled a rough road the day she died, and she moaned fearfully all the time. At night, one of the women came in as usual, but she made no reply to questions, so she thought her asleep and washed her face, then took her hand and discovered her pulse was nearly gone. She lived but a few moments, and her last words were, "Oh, Henry, if only you knew how we have suffered." The tent was set up and the corpse was laid out, and the next morning we took our last look at our mother's face. The grave was near the road. Willow brush was laid in the bottom and covered the body. The earth filled in and the train moved on. Her name was cut into a headboard, and that was all that could be done. So in 26 days we became orphans, 7 children of us, the oldest 14 and the youngest a babe. A few days before her death, finding herself in possession of her faculties and fully aware of her coming end, she had taken an affectionate farewell of her children and charged the doctor to take care of us. She made the same request of Captain Shaw. The baby was taken by a woman in the train, and all were literally adopted by the company. No one there was ready to do us any possible favor. I think the translation is bad. Everyone there was ready to do us any possible favor. This was especially true of Captain Shaw and his wife. Their kindness will ever be cherished in grateful remembrance of us all. Our parents could not have been more solicitous or careful. When our flour gave out, they gave us bread, as long as they had any, actually dividing their last loaf. To this day, Uncle Billy and Aunt Sally, as we call them, regard us with affection of parents. Blessings on his hoary head. At Snake River, they lay by to make our wagon into a cart, as our team was wearing out. Into this was loaded what was necessary. Some things were sold, and some left on the plains. The last of September we arrived at Grand Ronde, where one of my sister's clothes caught fire, and she would have burned to death, only that the German doctor, at the cost of burning his hands, saved her. One night the captain heard a child crying, and found my little sister had gotten out of the wagon and was perishing in the freezing air, for the nights were very cold. We had been out of flour and living on meat alone, so a few were sent in advance to get supplies from Dr. Whitman and return to us. Having so light a load, we could travel faster than other teams, and went on with Captain Shaw and the advance. Through the Blue Mountains, cattle were giving out and left lying on the road. We made but a few miles a day. We were in the country of Dr. Whitman's Indians, as they called themselves. They were returning from buffalo hunting and frequented our camps. They were loud in praise of the missionaries and anxious to assist us. Often they would drive up some beast that we had left behind as given out and return it to its owner. One day when they were making fire of wet wood, Francis thought to help the matter by holding his powder horn over a small blaze. Of course, the powder horn exploded, and it was a wonder he was left alive. He ran to the creek nearby and bathed his hands and face, and came back destitute of winkers and eyebrows, and his face was blackened beyond recognition. Such were the incidents and dangers and humorous features of the journey. So that is an excerpt that just tells one story told by Catherine Sager Pringle. And there's a lot more to their story, because what happened to them even after they got to, it was near Walla Walla, Washington, where they joined a missionary site of Dr. Whitman, and there were some things that happened that are beyond belief still coming up, and we're not going to get into all those details. If you want to do a little bit of research, you can research that, and a lot of those details are available. But basically what happened once they got to Dr. Whitman's place, they were basically all adopted by the family, and they helped out. And Dr. Whitman had run a Native American school and was also doing church services and a lot of stuff like that. And things were good for a couple of years until there was a Native American uprising, and the doctor was blamed for a measles epidemic, and a lot of the Sager children were then killed in the Indian uprising. And there's a National Historic Park there where this happened and everything. So not only did they end up losing their parents on the trail within a couple of years, a lot of quite a few of them were killed. The brothers were killed, and I believe one or two of the girls also died, and the ones that survived had lost their newly adopted parents again. So anyhow, that's one of the stories of the Oregon Trail, and I have a book that has a lot of different stories. Maybe I'll end up sharing some more if you like these kind of stories. I think it's good sometimes to go over some of this kind of stuff, because sometimes people think they have it hard today and they really have no clue what our ancestors went through just to make it and survive. So let me know if you like these kind of stories, if you have any comments, or if you have stories in your family from generations past in your family traveling the Oregon Trail, any, funny or interesting stories or whatever, definitely share them in the comments. I know growing up in Nebraska, it didn't have a lot of Oregon Trail type of stories, but there were a lot of pioneer stories, and some of them can be pretty interesting for sure. And if you like these kind of stories, definitely like and subscribe to my channel. The majority of people that watch my videos and listen to my videos and stuff are not subscribed. So thanks for listening.